Hi everybody. I wanted to do a quick video, just talk a little bit, kind of give an overview of Chapter 29, which you'll be reading this week and doing notes over. It's called Civil Rights Vietnam and the Ordeal of Liberalism. It's on page 781 in the text. A lot of ground covered in this chapter, starting with, it starts in 1960, the election of 1960. One of the most important ones in American history. John F. Kennedy is elected. The Kennedy presidency only gets about a page of the text, at least in this chapter directly. Starts on 782. Kennedy is elected by a narrow, razor-thin margin over Richard Nixon in 60. He is assassinated, as we know, in 63. So a lot of the things that Kennedy wanted to do, didn't happen until after he died. Even though he only gets minimal mention at the beginning of the chapter, for our audio chat this week, we're going to listen to his inaugural address. I've uploaded it in IC and Teams. There's also a video in Teams of the inaugural address. I'd encourage you to watch that if you could. Remember, I mentioned this in our chat. I'd like you to, if you can, to just kind of parallel not only what Kennedy says, but visually what it looks like compared to the Eisenhower address that we talked about last week, the military-industrial complex speech, which was given just a few days before Kennedy's inaugural address. Anyway, so Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas in 63. Lyndon Johnson then becomes president. Johnson was able to get more done than Kennedy. He had been Senate Majority Leader. He had a lot of experience in Congress, so that helped him as president. And he gets the 64 Civil Rights Act passed, which Kennedy was stuck in Congress under Kennedy. He gets the Voting Rights Act passed. He starts what's known as the Great Society, which was America's assault on poverty. It was a war on poverty. The Great Society programs, the biggies are Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start. Did a lot of really good things. Eventually, though, the Great Society programs are, the funding for a lot of those programs is cut because of America's increased involvement in Vietnam, which is talked about in this chapter too. Civil rights movement is addressed starting on 786. The Freedom Rides is the first thing that's mentioned. Freedom Rides start in the spring of 1961. It's an embarrassment to the Kennedy presidency that we have the racial violence going on. Kennedy was very slow to move on civil rights because he was worried about angering Southern Democrats. He needed their support. By June of 63, with the events in Birmingham, that's where there's a picture on 786, the fire hoses and the dogs are turned loose on protesters, peaceful protesters. Kennedy finally makes a stand in June of 63. I've uploaded that speech in Teams as well. I think it's from June 12th, 1963. So what Kennedy puts forth eventually turns into the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is passed after his death, and that bans segregation in public places. Gradually, as the 60s wears on, the civil rights movement does kind of take a turn to being more militant. Some people are tired of the peaceful protest of Dr. King. Those people would be groups like the Black Panthers. Even the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee starts to be led by a guy named Stokely Carmichael. They push for more direct action in possible violent ways, versus King was always nonviolent direct action. So the civil rights movement is discussed. Vietnam on 793, it's called the Agony of Vietnam. America had been involved in Vietnam since the 40s, but we get direct military involvement. The first Marines go in there in 1965. We had military advisors before. When Kennedy was president, it was military advisors, but Kennedy kept increasing military advisors into Vietnam. Johnson puts boots on the ground. He did not want to be the president to lose Southeast Asia to communism. This was during the time of containment. And so gradually, 65, 66, 67, 68. 68, I think, is the height of American troops in Vietnam. We're pushing for more and more troops. We get involved more heavily in Vietnam after Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, where Johnson says we were attacked. It was unprovoked. That's not true. And Vietnam becomes just a quagmire. And we don't get out until 73. Vietnam falls in 75. It's The Vietnam War is a wake-up call for America. It's a war that we lost, and we couldn't say that for a long time. And it's still, only now are people coming to terms with talking about Vietnam and what it meant. I think I've shared with you, my dad was a Vietnam veteran. He never talked about it. But Vietnam is discussed in the chapter. Chapter ends on 1968, the traumas of 68-801. We've got two major political assassinations in 68. We've got the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in April, shot by James Earl Ray outside of the Lorraine Motel. And then we've got the death of Bobby Kennedy in June of 68, shot by a guy named Sirhan Sirhan. Kennedy was running for president. Johnson had decided to not run because of Vietnam. He was eligible to run for another term. There was a peace Democrat named Eugene McCarthy who had challenged Johnson in the primaries and done very well. Robert F. Kennedy sees that. Johnson announces he's not going to run. Robert F. Kennedy decides to run. Robert F. Kennedy might have begun running for president a little bit before Johnson made that announcement. Anyway, Robert F. Kennedy wins the California primary. For all intents and purposes, it looks like he's going to be the Democratic nominee, nominated in Chicago. He's assassinated on the night of the California primary that he wins. Hubert Humphrey runs for the Democrats. He was Johnson's vice president. He's defeated by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had been defeated by Kennedy in the 1960 election. Richard Nixon had lost a race to be California governor in 62. He was Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years, so Richard Nixon makes a political comeback in 1968. He's promising law and order. He gives a famous speech that he's the candidate for the silent majority, the people that are not out protesting. By the way, as Vietnam intensifies, more and more people, specifically on college campuses, are protesting American involvement in Vietnam. It's those campus protesters that often got deferments. Vietnam fell disproportionately on the backs of poor kids who could not go to college and minorities. But back to 68, Richard Nixon wins a very, very close election in 68. He campaigns on a pledge. He's got a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. He doesn't really have a plan to end, a secret plan to end it. It becomes a plan known as Vietnamization, which is turning the war over to the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese. And that's where the chapter ends. Vietnam will be covered also in chapter 30. I uploaded something in Teams under AP Test Reviews. I want you guys to check that out. It's about a 20-minute YouTube video that really explains the DBQ rubric this year. It has changed a little bit. All it looks like, it's more opportunities for points, real similar language, but there's a video by a guy named Steve Heimler who's really good. Watch it, we'll talk about it, and start practicing DBQ things this week. I've got something for you to work on this week that'll be due next week. So I hope you guys are doing well and staying safe. I miss you. Please reach out to me, any problems, any questions, any issues you might have, and I'll talk to you soon.